Welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Lewin. Welcome to a special presentation called Texas's Power Rush. This was a special presentation I did for paid subscribers just about a week or so ago. I try to do these quarterly with the very latest statistics of growing demand, growing supply. We do have a lot of growing demand in Texas, 25% over the last 4 years, a tripling in the far west zone over the last 8 years. But there's also rapidly growing supply in an interconnection queue that is growing very rapidly. So covered all of that, not only solar and wind, but also batteries and natural gas. We have seen a doubling of natural gas plants in Texas interconnection queue. Covered all of that and much, much more. Demand response, quantifying how much of an impact that's having on the Texas market. So this really covered a lot of ground. What you'll hear is also a Q&A with subscribers at the end of this. So I hope you'll get a lot out of this. Always looking for feedback from folks as to what to cover in future ones of these. Really try to be quite comprehensive about what I think is the most dynamic market in the United States, certainly, and among the most dynamic markets in the entire world, the Texas and the ERCOT market. This is a paid episode. This was a presentation I do for paid subscribers. First 15 to 20 minutes is free as usual. And then after that is for paid subscribers. There were a lot of charts and graphs. So if you want to follow along, you can go to douglewin.com. You can see the whole video there. Also, that first 15 to 20 minutes we posted on the YouTube channel at Doug Lewin Energy. Thank you very much for listening. If you're already a subscriber, thank you. If you're not, please become one today at douglewin.com. And as always, leave us a 5-star review. Please tell friends, family, and colleague about the podcast and the Texas Energy and Power newsletter. Really helps people find us organically and helps with that growth, and we greatly appreciate it. And with that, enjoy the special presentation, Texas's Power Rush. All right, so let's start on the demand side. This is something everybody's talking about these days. Obviously, really fast rising demand. And I think the main point I want to make with this particular slide is that there's a whole lot of discussion out there about data centers and how load growth is coming. In Texas, this is not just a futuristic thing. We have load growth happening right now. This is historic up through 24. And what you're seeing for 2025 here is if the next 5 months go as the first 7 months did, because we had about a 6.5–7% growth in the first 7 months relative to 2024. So this all adds up to, under 400 terawatt hours 4 years ago we're probably going to be close to, but not quite at 500 terawatt hours by the end of the year. Phenomenal demand growth, like nothing we've seen. I was saying the 60s for a while, and somebody corrected me. I always appreciate being corrected. If you think I'm saying something wrong and you've got data to back that up, please send it my way. Actually, the late 70s, we were coming out of the energy crisis, might have had similar growth rates, probably not exceeding what we're at right now, but pretty close. In 2025, every single month has seen more consumption than the same month 1 year ago. July consumption was up even more. That's energy use, of course, than in previous months. But interestingly, peak demand was only up about 1%. So this does suggest that we're seeing higher system utilization. And here's another way to look at this. So this is really, I think, really interesting and not talked about nearly enough. Our minimum load is much, much higher in 25 over the last couple of months. August is also trending. We're still have some more days to go, so we could have and temperatures are down a little bit, so maybe we'll have a lower load before the month is over. But I was looking back, and I think the lowest so far this month is like 53, whereas last year was like 48. So that suggests, again, much higher system utilization, while the peaks aren't necessarily going higher. That's partially a function of this summer isn't as hot as last summer, but it also could be a sign that loads are changing the way they consume power, and that some of these, particularly data centers, are consuming more power in the evening. Still too early to tell, but it's kind of suggestive of that. So the growth that we have seen in these last 4 years looks like it is actually going to accelerate in 2026. This is from EIA. They think that we are going to see 14% growth next year. That would be double the growth rate, and that would be unprecedented since probably, I think I'm on solid ground to say 1950s, since we've seen that kind of load growth in any year would really be extraordinary. Of course, growth was high coming out of COVID, but even then, I don't think it was 14%. So these are really phenomenal figures. And obviously they're showing high load growth in other parts of the country, but really nothing like ERCOT. There's nothing like working on this stuff within Texas right now, really an extraordinary time. Where is this load growth coming from? This is from an Encore filing. Encore is the utility from the Dallas-Fort Worth area when they do their energy efficiency filings because industrial consumers are exempted from those efficiency programs. They have to break out the use according to residential and small commercial and large commercial and industrial. You can see on the residential side, even though a lot of people are moving into their service territory, load growth is not zero, but it's not very fast, about 1%. And then here's what we see on the industrial side. Again, not just the projections, the historical increases are just amazing. So the vast majority of the load growth is coming from the industrial side. And again, I always want to clarify because we're getting all very used to looking at, the 5 years out projections with these big hockey stick curves. This is not a 5 year out projection. This is history. This ends at 2024. And the far west load zone has literally tripled in the space of about 8 years. Really just phenomenal to the point that far west is although South Central has seen a lot of growth of its own, it might actually pass South Central. So one thing I also just want to point out here, and this is a little speculative, but I like bringing this stuff up because I know there's a lot of smart people on this call, and I want to hear when we get to the comments and Q&A at the end what you think of this. My theory here is that notice there's a big bump in North Central and South Central in 2022. I think that that has something to do with high gas prices that year, that we're seeing a move to electrify. Pure speculation, but would love, anecdotal evidence or if somebody's got some reports and data showing that. But it's the theory I'm going to work on a little bit. The large load queue. So this is futuristic because we're looking at the queue. Of course, it's history based on what's actually entered the queue, but this is not showing what's actually been built. I'll show that in just a minute. But the queue is up 70% since March. The queue is now 188 gigawatts. Of course, our peak load in Texas about 85. The total amount of resources on the grid, nameplate resources, everything all in is like 175, 180. So that's a pretty eye-popping number. The history is a little less dramatic. Looking back 1 year, these are the actual large loads that ERCOT is measuring on the grid. The definitions of large load are a little squishy. Of course, we have a lot of industrial load far in excess of this, but they're really talking about Bitcoin mines and data centers. And we have seen about a 30% increase in 1 year. We've got about 7 gigawatts of it on the grid, another 13 with planning studies. So, to put this 188 in perspective, we aren't seeing that meteoric of a rise. Let's now look at supply. Are we building enough to keep up with that? So everybody talks about the large load queue. It gets a whole lot of attention in the press and at the legislature, but the generator queue is also growing extremely rapidly, right? Roughly a 20, 30, something like that percent growth in 2 years, all the way up to 433 gigs. So I like to put these numbers next to each other. Yes, the large load queue is very large. Note that the generator queue is more than twice as large, suggesting perhaps we might actually be able to meet that load growth. Here's the interconnection queue broken down. This is when you add it all up. This is the 433 I showed in the last. 3 things I want to point to in this. They're all in that right column there. More than half the queue is dispatchable now. Batteries and gas exceed wind and solar. There are now more batteries in the queue than solar. Kind of a fascinating change that has occurred over the last 12 months, 181 to 163. And notice that while in 2025, solar still exceeds battery, look at the purple line, 2026 batteries far in excess of solar. And that even accelerates in the next several years in 27 and 28. And last but not least, gas is catching up to wind, which is really kind of fascinating. Just a couple of years ago, there was a huge delta between those in wind's favor, and gas is catching, hasn't quite caught up, but is catching up. And here's a look at the gas queue. This is a story that I don't think is talked about nearly enough. There's this whole line that like, oh, the ERCOT market isn't working. It's not incentivizing resources to come in. Some of this, of course, is Texas Energy Fund, but Texas Energy Fund is 10 gigawatts. The increase here is 24 gigawatts in the space of 1 year. That's that's a huge increase in the gas queue. Pretty striking. But there's only so many gas turbines available. So this was a slide that Dwarkesh, the podcaster, had on his podcast with Casey Hanmer when they were talking about solar and AI. It was a great discussion. Highly recommended. Obviously didn't agree with everything they said, but really interesting. I learned a lot from it. And I hadn't seen this one before. Perhaps some of you have seen this before, but it was my first time to see this graphically like this. This is gas turbine additions over the last 40 years. And here's, right, the wave of restructuring that happened, right? Texas had restructuring in 99, Senate Bill 7, huge build out of gas here in America. The light green is showing US, but you're seeing a global view too. And here's where we are at 2025, well below the peak of 2003. Sorry, did I get that wrong? This one's 2025, I think. Yes. And now you're seeing like just a huge increase, like a 50% increase in the projected amount of manufacturing of turbines. So a lot of times people say, oh, this gas turbine crisis isn't that big a deal. Manufacturers will just ramp up. Sure, they'll ramp up to produce 120 to 140 gigawatts for the entire planet. Right. So if we're looking at 188 gigs in the large load interconnection queue, ERCOT projecting a 50 gig increase, and the entire United States getting something like 20 gigawatts, right, per year if that ramp up is met. So there is going to be a major constraint on gas turbines. And we're seeing this more and more deals at $2,500 a kilowatt with delivery in 2029 or 2030. And that $2,500 kilowatt literally two and a half times the amount a turbine was 3 years ago. And that's not the only sort of headwind for gas. The price of gas, obviously, this is so obvious, I hesitate to say it, but I think it's important just to make sure we're all on the same page. Solar and wind, right? Once you build it, there's capital costs, but once you build it, the fuel costs are not there. Of course, there are fuel costs for gas, and the price of gas the last 2 years has been very, very low. Big bump up in 2022, which is what I was talking about earlier, with probably a surge in electrification. But here, really low prices in 23 and 24. Higher this year, sitting somewhere right around 3. And this is the short-term energy outlook from the Energy Information Administration, which just came out a week or two ago. And they're projecting, somewhere in a $4 to $5 range next year. And so that is another major headwind for gas turbines. So there are some being built. There will be more built, but there's only so many available, and the cost to run them, not only the capital cost to build them, but the cost to run them will be pretty high. And that's why we're seeing this, right? That is why we're seeing this. This is why we're seeing more of the combustion turbines built, because they're low capacity factors. So that price of gas impacts them, but they're only going to run at times of very high demand, high prices, not necessarily high demand, actually, because if there's a lot of solar, but of high prices of scarcity. This is in a presentation that was made today at the Supply Analysis Working Group at ERCOT. I've seen various forms of it, but haven't seen one quite this clear. Appreciate that ERCOT produced this. Really, picture's worth 1,000 words. I don't think I need to say too much about this one. Just meteoric rise of solar and storage, obviously coming through very, very clearly on there. This is also from that Dwarkesh podcast and for the conversation with Casey Hanmer. And as I put in the reading and podcast picks that I put out Sunday, quoting Dwarkesh, he asked Casey, so the acceleration is accelerating? And Casey said, yes, it is. The learning rate for solar was significant over the last 40 years, but when you actually plot it separately over the last 20 years, it's actually even more extreme. This is the reduction in, if I'm understanding this right, which I think I am, the reduction in cost with every doubling of deployment is 44%. Really just an astounding learning rate for solar, and the reason why we are seeing these just wild numbers from all over the world, from China to Pakistan to Latin America to the US, really, really kind of everywhere. Let's talk about Texas. I should have labeled this better, but this is Texas generation. This is through July. We're at about 38 terawatt hours compared to about 26 last year. So just about a 50% increase, just a smidge below if it's like 47% increase year over year in solar production. This is showing just the change from year to year, just the increase, right? So we're up to 38, 12 additional terawatt hours through the first 7 months, 3 additional terawatt hours of wind. The entire increase in Texas consumption this year is about 17 terawatt hours. That is almost entirely met by solar and wind. And then when you consider that storage charging has accounted for an additional 2 terawatt hours this year, basically 100% of new demand is being served by solar and wind. This is showing the wholesale storage charging with WSL, which is wholesale storage load. Last year, through the first 7 months, about a terawatt hour. This year, about 3. So that's what the 2 is showing here. So 100% of new demand being served by new incremental renewable power. I thought this was